So welcome back to Political Noise. This is our second episode focusing on Bitch Better Have My Money, and the themes being power, gender, and capitalism, possibly not in that order. And do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm Koshka in the philosophy department at Nottingham.
And I'm Hannah in the music department at Nottingham. And we are here to discuss a collaborative playlist we put together based on the Rihanna trap song. So that's a form of hip hop. Bitch better have. I always think it's bitch gotta have. Bitch better have my money. Which is loosely based on a true story about an accountant that stole money from Rihanna, but has become its own special thing. So why did we pick this track? Or what speaks to you about it?
Why did we pick this track? Well, this track has a particular association for me, actually, which is a few years ago when there was a national strike in universities, as there was again this past year. But this was a couple of years ago, and it was in response to the a kind of announcement that pensions for university workers were going to be kind of absolutely destroyed, and there was a strike in response to this, and the one of the things that kind of happens in a strike that's very important is that the workers who are kind of refusing to work in protest at some way in which their bosses are treating them badly, and in order to demand something better as workers, workers come together and form a picket line, which is a kind of a space in, often physically in front of a building where a workplace, and the point of the picket line is to kind of come together in solidarity and say, we're not going to go in and work, and what the kind of the bosses, or in the case of university, it's kind of the university management will want is for the workers' action to have no impact on the kind of smooth running of business as usual. That's how a strike gets defeated, is for the place to basically keep on running as though nothing's happened. And the reason a strike is effective is because it shows how much the kind of institution, whatever it is, depends on all of the hard work of those workers all of the time. So a picket line can be a really kind of exciting place. It can be a place for a lot of conversations, where everyone has to kind of make their own decision about whether to cross it, whether to be in solidarity with the workers who are striking, or undermining that by kind of carrying on with business as usual. So a picket line could be a place for a lot of really exciting and interesting conversations about those kinds of like moral and political questions. And as is always the case, a space for thinking and talking about moral and political questions is vastly improved by the addition of great music. So when we were, I was working at KCL, King's College London, at the time, and what we took along to the picket line was this sound system on a bike, which is called pedals, and it's got a bit of a kind of colorful history itself. Yeah. This sound system on a bike, and it's kind of covered with stickers from all kinds of different protests and stuff that it's been on. But we set up with this sound system, and played loads of tunes, and also had did lots of talks and kind of teach out to people who worked in the university, talking about their experience working there, talking about the things that they cared about. It was kind of like workers and students and other people from outside the university kind of coming together, and like it was kind of like a vision of in a small way of the kind of education that we would want to have, which is actually free and open to everyone and not stuck away behind security barriers that you can't go past unless you've paid £9,000 a year. So that was what the picket line was about. And one of the tracks, which was just an absolute favorite on the picket line, was this Rihanna track. And I think part of the reason for that is that it just expresses so kind of joyfully aggressively this kind of like demand for restitution for something that's been taken from you. And that is that is the kind of experience of workers exploited under capitalism in all kinds of different ways in different contexts. But it's also kind of funny, I think, to address the university management and the kind of government who make the education policy and so on in that way.
Yeah, it's kind of anti-pomp and circumstance, isn't it? Like it's kind of it's kind of subversive in a fun kind of way, but as you say, joyfully aggressive, and it's something that I think we kind of lose sometimes because there's so much not bizarrely because capitalism, but inherently negative stuff and rhetorics, ways of talking about striking and workers fighting for their rights, and that reclamation of a great pop track, but also using it in this sort of kind of as an anthem for free education, but also fair working is delicious.
Definite anthem.
Great.
Anthem.
I find that it kind of funny in the context of the capitalist theme that we have, because Rihanna is one of the most successful popular music artists of her kind, with such a fascinating empire away from music. Like her beauty line has been so controversial, and yet it's so brilliant and has made so much money. And it's controversial because it's color inclusive, for anyone that's not aware. And she began with, I think it's 47 foundation shades in order to make it possible for people of all backgrounds to access this kind of stuff. And so there's a form of subversive content in it, but it is entirely built in its branding and its association to her and her name. And that sort of tension is always really fun when you have this associated with, kind of a restitution of financial freedom, if you like. The juxtaposition of that's really fun. So the point of difference is I really enjoy that.
What does the track mean to you?
It's similar but not similar. I associate it with going to see my friends who lived in a squat in an area of London I won't name, and the building used to be owned by a parent of someone they knew, and there are all sorts of things we could go down that we're not going to go down, but if ever they drove past, they would put this on like boom speakers and like make the house shake with this song, and we would just scream it like hooligans at each other. And I just associate it with this carefree moment of being I don't know, I don't want to say young because that sounds really pretentious, but you know what I mean, the sort of just being teenagers, and I guess we were adults, but whatever, being with my friends, but thinking about resistance, if that makes sense. It to me it is a two fingers up song with swag, if that makes sense, that you have a great time when you're thinking about it. It's not a protest song in the context of give me my rights back, in a heartfelt sort of earnest way, perhaps. This is much more about getting the message across in a really fun but powerful, it is that, as you say, joyful aggression way. So yeah, for me it's screaming it at my friend's dad's car as he drives down the road in London.
Yeah.
Just, you know, an entire image I'll leave you
Yeah, well, the kind of the joyful kind of moment really reminds me there of another of the songs that I picked, which is the Wells Fargo song. And actually, I was just yesterday reading this book by Jackie Wang, which is called Carceral Capitalism. So it's very much focusing on the ways in which the kind of penal system and carceral institutions, which means institutions that incarcerate people, so like, for example, prisons, have been really integral to capitalism, you know, from its inception a few centuries back, up to the kind of contemporary forms of mass incarceration that we see today. And one of the things that she really brings out is that you know, it's not, while when we think about capitalism, maybe we think oh, that's mostly about you know, waged workers in and a kind of, you know, maybe struggle between the bosses and the workers in a workplace, and those workers who are being paid a wage. An awful lot of what's gone on under capitalism has not been that, and is not that. So slave labor, for example, is absolutely indispensable to the history of the kind of accumulation of wealth by colonial powers such as Britain. Many other forms of forced labor, such as kind of indentured servitude, were really crucial to the development of capitalism. Now, of course, we have prison labor, and the kind of replacement of the institution of slavery with kind of the penal system is something else that we could talk about. But another thing that Jackie Wang focuses in on is debt, and is the way that debt and like predatory lending to poor people and people of color in particular, and she's focusing on the United States, has just been so integral to the story of capitalism, right up to, of course, the subprime mortgage kind of like absolute shit show that lay behind the financial crisis of 2008. And debt is like a way of what sometimes gets called accumulating through dispossession. So you can accumulate, you being a kind of like a capitalist, a multinational corporation, you can accumulate through exploitation, which means getting people to work for you, and then kind of basically profiting off that by paying them less than the value of what they make. But there's also accumulation through dispossession, which occurred, for example, when native people were dispossessed of their lands, and then occurs through like predatory lending, getting people into debts that they can't pay, and then all of their assets are stripped from them. And it was just very interesting that she picks up on Wells Fargo, the bank Wells Fargo, as absolutely kind of outstandingly embroiled in this kind of looting, as she calls it. So like looting from above, not looting from below, what often gets called looting. You know, in a riot, maybe in the like in the riots in the UK in 2011, some people were looting, taking things from like big corporations, JD Sports or whatever, and that's called looting. But she's saying actually looting is kind of, when it's done from the top going down, is kind of business as usual in capitalism. So this was a long way to get to the fact that that song Wells Fargo is about get a gun, I'm gonna rob a Wells Fargo, and it's a just really like collective and joyful song about robbing a Wells Fargo. And when you read about like in the Wells Fargo actually talking about the people that they were lending money to on these kind of mortgage schemes that they knew would result, and they were supposed to result and would profit from resulting in poor people of color losing their homes, and they talked about them as quote unquote mud people, and that's the kind of institution that is central to the operations of capitalism. She's like, this is not an exception, this is kind of the norm. And so it's really interesting to think about the kind of like the kind of joyfulness of, well, I'm gonna fucking rob them because they've robbed all of us. That's a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you were talking about that, and it was making me think about a different form of structural oppression under that sort of capitalist model. One of the tracks that I picked, and this was completely subconscious, and that was really interesting to me as well, because
we love the subconscious. Let's talk about that.
I'm very I found this one particularly, found it very interesting that clearly when I picked the tracks, I had a very clear vision in mind that I don't remember having at all. But there's sort of several things to say, but the one I wanted to highlight is the song Money, That's What I Want. And I picked it because the version that's in the playlist is from a film called Crazy Rich Asians, but it's actually a song that has been recorded a number of times. And I don't really know how I missed this, given how much I love and know about Motown, but I hadn't realized it was originally a Motown song. The original version I thought I knew was a Beatles song, but had become popularized in the UK by a band called the Flying Lizards, and then had been reimagined once again by the Malaysian singer who performs it for Crazy Rich Asians. But it's actually a song, it was actually the first hit song that was released it was the first song released by the original Motown label, so Tamla, that garnered success. But as with so many songs from the Motown, and particularly the pre-Motown era, it is a sort of a community primarily of white artists who have become well known for this sort of musical song. And I was just sort of thinking about the tension of this being about sort of aspirational wealth and the idea of money as agency in the context of a legacy of larger corporations stealing, they like to use the word appropriating now, music from Black creators. And that actually, while that isn't quite what's happened here, you can see how the legacy of that practice that, built the careers of people like Elvis Presley is borne out in this song. And that sort of like that journey hadn't sort of played itself out in my mind when I suggested this song. I was thinking very much about a film that's about material wealth and the glamorization of extreme wealth and the need to conform to the practices associated with extreme wealth and what that means culturally. That's where I'd started. But it's interesting when you were talking about the sort of idea of let's go rob a Wells Fargo, and not thinking about the mechanisms of capitalism as actually the ways in which we undercut people in insidious ways, being actually vital to how music has developed as well. So yeah, it was just one of those things where I was seeing sort of an interesting parallel. That was the song I wanted to ask you about. Nothing great in Britain.
Nothing great about Britain.
Yeah. Nothing great about Britain.
Yeah.
I didn't know this song, and it made me laugh so much.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about it. There's a lyric about Kate Middleton and the Queen, which in it that just I can't remember it exactly, but it's something like, "I will shoot you," respectfully.
I'll show a bit of respect for you if you'll show some respect for me,
Yeah.
Elizabeth. You can't.
And it's done with this beautifully like faux posh accent. It's
well,
just
absolutely.
joyful.
That's a common thread with the Wells Fargo song. Actually,
Yeah.
is this kind of mocking imitation of the ruling class. Which does really bring out the kind of cultural content of that it brings out the kind of cultural aspects of class, while class is like, as is made very clear by the fact that you're talking about huge structures of like material wealth. Class is not just about culture. It's not just about accent, but it's interesting to think about how those kinds of cultural signifiers are connected to it. And actually, I was thinking about when you were talking before about kind of stealing music and stealing music for Black Lives, and like the way that this kind of concept of stealing, in a way, only makes sense if once it's attached to some kind of vision or other of the right kind of ownership. Like it doesn't. It's kind of the definition of stealing is sort of taking something that you shouldn't have. But like what's really contested is what you should have. And that's something that gets like often kind of slid under the rug when you just think, well, stealing is taking things which you don't legally own. Because we have to think like, well, where did this legal structure of the particular forms of property that we have now actually come from? Because it hasn't always been this way. And actually, this is a point at which I would like to whip out a tip.
Oh yeah,
that I found that I found earlier today when I was obviously working hard. So here we go. Wait, I need to turn this up. I'm going to try to show you. Boom. It'll be so worth it. Just wait for this.
People are not socially distancing. I just told all 2 neighbours, I was like, you shouldn't be in anyone else's home. And they were like, oh, sorry, we thought this was a forest. And I was like, yes, but it's also technically my garden. So don't make me drive down here again. People are not socially distancing.
React.
Entitlement. It's just yeah. It's so it gets exactly to the heart of what is ownership, and I think that's something it's really hard to, particularly with music. And one of the things I find really interesting in the period that I study is the introduction of unions and copyright for musicians happens during my particular period of expertise. And
what is that period? Could you
roughly speaking, it's in the period from the 1930s through into the 1950s, and I look specifically at America, and there's a lot of and the musical that I wrote my PhD about includes the first choreography ever to be copyrighted. So people trying to codify what parts of a performance can belong to someone and also should be preserved in certain ways that are associated with monetary and legal status. And that's a whole that's a whole other thing. But it was, I really, that TikTok just made me think about so many things. But because you have sort of class and entitlement and privilege and ownership, but also what is home and what is territory and what is ours. And I mean, superficially, it also made me think about who we perceive capitalism as belonging to, which is the reason, or who we perceive agency as inherently belonging to, and that sort of, and the politics.
So by agency, you mean like kind of
so who
ability to act or have power?
Who has ability, who has sort of socially approved ability to act, to exist. I mean the reason that I use the word steal in the context of that music or that particular song is the sense that in a theory no one should own music, but in a society where someone can decide to copyright Happy Birthday and then charge every institution globally that uses it for a certain amount of royalties, we have to then look at how those mechanisms are used as a form of oppression. And I was, and so I added, as I said, I didn't add that song with that in mind, but one of the things that TikTok makes me think about is who is allowed to claim ownership of certain things. So it was never that Black Americans weren't allowed to make music. It's just that they weren't allowed to have their music played on all radio stations, for example. And therefore, it was possible for people to extract and reshape. And where reinterpretation is one of the joys of music, it became a weapon in this context. And so there's this real tension between those two things. And it also makes me think of one of the other tracks that I picked, but I can see your point. So
I was just really struck by how that brought out the connection between kind of wealth and economic power and status on the one hand, and access to public speech, the means of public speech on the other hand. So thinking about who gets on the radio, who gets on TV, whose voices are listened to. There are, of course, other ways of having us listened to than radio and TV. We might think of kind of universities and the academy as like one, also another way in which people's voices might be heard or might be given a kind of stamp of approval and able to get out there. And this notion of agency is actually really brings these things together, because what it is to be an agent, and I think the sense that you're using it is like to be able to make a difference, to have like what you to be able to translate what you intend into stuff actually happening in the world. If you have a lot of money, you can make that happen, right? You can get your voice out there so that's the messaging that everybody has seen on all of the billboards, or in and you can pay you can donate to a political party so that you're a big pharmaceutical company. You can make sure that the like political parties are going to protect your interests when they get into power, because otherwise you're not going to be funding them anymore. And just thinking about that connection between sort of economic power and then kind of political influence through being able to have voice in the public sphere, how much property ownership like defines like access to being able to speak and be heard. And that's why these kind of kind of protest and resistance against that so often has to be disruptive, and so often kind of has to take the form of using spaces in ways that are not sanctioned by the law, are not, because the way that because space is owned, and if you don't own that stuff, you don't get to have your voice heard in it. Like business as usual, going back to kind of what we were talking about before, business as usual is like those who are oppressed not having their voices heard. So then there has to be some kind of disruption of that in order to like participate and in order to be a kind of agent, and that often requires coming together, because as an individual there's very, very little that you can do unless you have like shitloads of money and the kind of family connections and own a forest.
It's so, I'm conscious of time, but it's so funny seeing that, because it just, I picked the track Diamonds because it's a reimagining, or it's a quotation of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend.
My auntie would always sing that every time when we were playing cards. Every time a diamond would come up, she would sing the song "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend," and like there's such an interesting history with music hall as well.
I'm a little bit obsessed with Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes as a whole. So disclaimer. And
interesting
because the evolution is so interesting, but actually the point of the song in its original form was subversive, and now we see it, but also who a gold digger is depends on your vantage point. Is that a character type, sometimes a stereotype, sometimes an archetype, depending on who you are? So a stereotype being a negative way of looking at a common characteristic, and an archetype accepting a characteristic that we recognize transcends a number of contexts. Is a gold digger an empowered position of someone reclaiming and finding a way of existing in a space where they wouldn't otherwise allowed to be? Or is it, a terrible, disgusting capitalist venture that we should all look down on? And there is a class and power dimension at play. So the first thing to say is that Gentlemen Prefer Blondes was written as a short story originally by Anita Loos to bitch about the girlfriend of her friend she didn't like, who she thought was extorting money from him. So it was written almost as a revenge piece in the mid 1930s, and people thought it was so funny that it then turned into a series that became a musical, and then it became a film, and so on and so forth. And I find the journey it's gone on from a revenge story to a story about a character who has been badly treated by men, and therefore uses her sexuality to find safety and security in a new way, on the basis of having had negative experience in the past, to ending up where we are now, with it being the first track released for a DC comic film, one of the massive sort of industrial empires of mass market filmmaking. And that in the video we have almost an anti-hero, I guess, a morally fluid character zoning out abuse, but also nodding to Marilyn Monroe and nodding to Moulin Rouge. So again, we're dealing with sex work then. And the position of womanhood, I suppose, gender was one of our themes. And I was just thinking about, we perceive capitalism and power often through gendered lines. And one of the things I find interesting about the Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend trajectory as a whole is how that woman, the gold digger character, is reinvented every few years to be a slightly different person that can be put down. So we've moved from extorting money from wealthy men to being a criminal who's anti-prisons, interestingly, coming full circle in the Birds of Prey film. And yeah, I just find it fascinating in terms of who we permit agency to, but also what capitalism means. That even in a capitalist aspiration to have nice things, and to be at the top of the ladder and have social agency not to do work which is deemed to be the thing that you're trying to avoid to some extent is still a negative aspiration if you are not the right person. And I just find that fascinating.
It's so interesting the way that just saying the word gold digger, you automatically think it's so gendered that you automatically think that you're talking about a woman, and that it's one of the ways that I always heard that diamonds are a girl's best friend song, its kind of subversive content, was another kind of huge feature of capitalism. When I was saying before, it's not just all about waged work. A huge amount of unwaged work is done by women in the form of kind of domestic labor, which is often unpaid or very low paid when it is paid, and kind of caring work. This is a huge thing increasingly, like in Britain, for example, when the breakdown of public services, that kind of work is kind of privatized, elder care, childcare, and so on. And the one of the features of the kind of ideology that props up capitalism, these kind of ideas that help to keep it going, make it seem kind of inevitable, make it seem good or natural or a just way for things to be, is that it's involved presenting unpaid work by women as kind of natural and a fulfillment of our womanly nature. And this idea of the association between women, or particularly kind of white women, and home is in order to kind of maintain this kind of unpaid workforce that are going to do all of the work of kind of raising every new generation of workers, and just thinking how like that gets kind of, I think we'll definitely come back to this in later weeks, but that gets kind of romanticized as is it so wonderful when you meet the perfect someone, and then isn't it great to be in a relationship of economic dependence, and what the kind of diamonds are a girl's best friend thing does is say actually that is a really precarious position to be in, where you're always at the kind of behest of some guy who can withdraw his approval, withdraw his patronage, and so you then have to kind of please him, and you are kind of in a subordinate relationship because of that. But one of the going back to the forest thing, it's all about the forest. It's all about the forest, because the forests being kind of private property in this absolutist sense was like a result of some really extremely violent and heavy duty state action particularly in the 18th century. So what had previously, it was the case that things like kind of forests and large sections of the countryside in Britain, for example, were understood as commons. So if you were a kind of cottager, then you were able to collect wood and kind of take you would be able to use the natural resources of those forests in a kind of sustainable way. That then in the kind of 17th and 18th century becomes redefined as private property. Now it counts as stealing if you do those ordinary things that you needed to do in order to survive. A huge amount of violence is required on the part of the state to enforce that new set of property relations. So huge use of kind of hanging, execution, flogging. John Locke, a philosopher from the 17th century, had lots of suggestions for more and more gory punishments, to cutting off people's ears for begging, and generally kind of disciplining people into this new form of property, where if you didn't have that property, you were going to have to go and work for somebody who did. And something that a feminist kind of historian and philosopher, social theorist, Silvia Federici, talks about a lot, that I think is really important, is that this idea of women as kind of naturally suited to unpaid caring work in a sort of home that's idealized as a kind of safe haven, private sphere. That whole ideology is developed at the same time. So it's about taking away women's agency in order to force them into this unpaid work on which capitalist profit is then going to depend, at the same time as taking away the resources from the kind of the mass of people, and making it into the private property of a few.
I'm conscious that we need to wrap up, but there's so much to think about in it. Before we got into sort of the sort of destruction of sort of mass property, if you like, it was making me think about the Tina Turner thing, which is that when Tina Turner was in an abusive relationship with her husband Ike Turner previously, and this song is infamous in the narrative of that relationship. So the song River Deep Mountain High, which is on the playlist, is infamous. But the reason that I thought about it is that when Tina Turner decided to divorce Ike Turner in the end, the only thing she asked for in the divorce settlement was her name, which is his surname. And so she didn't receive any of the property, any of the money, any of the copyright for their entire catalogue. And she walked away, and the only thing she wanted was her stage name. And I was just thinking about what we own and who we own, and the fact that we're now at a point where owning a person's name is a condition of legal conversation. And going from the context of, open spaces and you're in a forest, but it's also my home, to I created this thing with you and I can't even have my contribution to that, because we now codify what belongs to who all of the time at every stage. And although now we see Tina Turner and we think of Tina Turner perhaps in an isolated context, her career was built on this tension of her not having the same legal rights and not knowing what that would mean for her moving beyond. And I was just thinking about the sort of micro macro issues at play there, in terms of, the politics of space versus the politics of individualism, and how those things sort of hit against each other. Any closing thoughts you want to add to that?
Wow, I didn't know any of that. So that's just like really fascinating, and also quite kind of
tragic. It's awful.
Heartbreaking. And so I think that the kind of maybe the final thing, what has kind of come out from the discussion to me most strongly, is the way that you can't really think about capitalism without thinking about gender, and without thinking about race and racism at the same time, historically and in the present. That's one thing. And I guess the other thing is, one of the tracks that I picked there is Normal People. And it talks about the norm being cruel, which I thought was like the Arcade Fire song. It's a great track. So I think for me, the kind of taking kind of business as usual and like just the kind of the norm, what we're expected to conform to and kind of take for granted, like just looking at how cruel that is, how like what counts as order is kind of premised on this like systematic precarity and an unsafety and suffering for so many people. And then looking at, well, how did these norms come about historically? They haven't always been this way. Kind of denaturalizing them, remembering that they aren't natural. That's the other really crucial thing in kind of understanding this matrix of power, gender, capital, race. Yeah. What about you? Did you have any? What came out of this conversation for you?
Something that really struck me, and we're going to come to this more in another and then in another part, but was how centered on binarism, on the idea of yes or no, one state or another, this hinges, and that therefore like being in a complex gender position or existing in a difficult race identity, depending on where in the world you are, is to be outside of the binary as well. And one thing that's sort of come out in these songs and in these stories is sort of the mechanism of categorization and requiring that categorization, so determining details and features of someone in order to stratify, in order to order where they should be and how they should exist, but also that there's sort of no scope in the language and the rhetoric around it to exist outside of those squares, boxes, lists, however you want to visualize it. And I always come back to a queer theorist called Kate Bornstein. Is it Bornstein? I think it's Bornstein. And they talk about gender theory, and they talk about binary gender being two semicircles that are together, and therefore if you approach gender in this way, should anything from one side move to the other, it breaches the integrity of the semicircle. Whereas if you see gender as a whole circle with lots of things inside it, then you can form all sorts of collaborations and partnerships depending on who you are and what you want, and that organicism, it actually removes violence. And that is something, I mean, we've talked passively about forms of violence the whole way through this conversation, but I think something that's really important when we're thinking about sort of anti-capitalist conversations or ways of disrupting capitalist narratives that are kind of just ingrained in us is also thinking about, is there violence here, and what is the violence? Because there is a difference between disruption, which can be really important interventive action, and violence that is deliberately contrived to create harm, and that those two things exist in tension but are not the same. And I was just thinking about how that's a lot. There's a lot to think about in there. But I do think that there's something.
But also the thought that when business as usual is causing so much harm, you can kind of be participating in that without intending
absolutely.
And yet the result can be so incredibly harmful. And the point about categorization and the constant like categorizing and hierarchizing of every aspect of human beings and human lives, that being really, really a crucial feature of capitalism. I think that's really important, that we can think about that happening kind of very kind of concretely and day to day with institutions like, of course, like prisons and borders and so on, but also schools. They, like, how much through the education system at every moment you're being graded and categorized, and like, you know, your behavior is getting this many stars compared with that person, or you're jumping through this hoop or that hoop in order to be put into a category, or you're being categorized as abnormal compared with this, that, or the other standard. And it's thought that with the kind of like image of gender as a kind of as a binary, you know, you have to be a man or a woman, there's nothing in between, everyone's one or the other, which is like absolute bollocks about human life and about biology. But what you do if you impose these categories is that you then create abnormality, as in you then if you say this is normal, this is the category, then you kind of define a whole bunch of people out of it. Those people don't fit, and they are subject to all kinds of social sanction and policing and being forced to fit. But actually the abnormal is only abnormal compared in kind of as defined by this norm. So we really have to question what the fuck these norms are. Because you don't find them just kind of wandering around. Yeah, exactly. You know, okay, that's a great place to end. Norms, you don't find them just wandering around in the forest. We were kind of saying at the just before we clicked record, I'm not sure about having this conversation now because I'm kind of feeling a bit shitty today. But actually, I'm reminded of a seminar that I had about capitalism with some students, and they were kind of discussing and making a like poster like, what is capitalism, what are its defining features. And one of the things that they wrote down that's just like really stuck with me is hopelessness. They like, what is capitalism? And they wrote hopelessness. And I think that like it's important to spend some time acknowledging how we feel about the situation. I don't think we should, you know, just stay in that moment of hopelessness all of the time, but acknowledging that we feel it is important sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a really profound note to end on. Recognize how you feel and remember that you don't ever find norms just wandering around
in the forest.
Which is my home.